89. Of course, as they'd say in Tennessee, it's a dab cold. And it's good to see you here. There's some people I wouldn't expect to be here if it was 100 degrees. But most of the ones that are here are always expected. There's an interesting thing that has come up because of the study of Judges that we need to understand. That being something that God stated in the book of Hosea, the 7th chapter, if you will flip over there, and the 13th verse. We're going to go to another place in Hosea. Hosea, Joel, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Daniel, Hosea, Joel. So you're pretty well cued in there. Hosea 7:13. They sacrifice upon the tops of the mountains and burn incense upon the hills under oaks and poplars and elms. Oh, I'm in the 4th chapter. I was going to say that didn't sound like what I'd studied. All right, the third. Yeah. Woe unto them, for they have fled from me. Destruction unto them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I have redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me. Now turn to the 13th chapter and the 9th and the 10th verses. O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself, but in me is thy help. I will be thy king. Where is any other that may serve thee in all thy cities? And thy judges, of whom thou saidest, give me a king and princes. I gave thee a king in mine anger, and took him away in my wrath. The question I want to ask you is, in societal situations that we find ourselves in, we have what is called a king. The question is, why? Now, we're not really familiar with kings in America. It's been something we've been privileged not to be a part of. But it's been something on the internet that's been, if you look at it, grilled into you about the Romanovs. The Romanovs were the kings of Russia. And the Romanovs were killed about 1919. What was the reason that the Romanovs were killed? Hold your answer. We'll get back to it in a minute. Why is it that they fell in such disfavor? Again, hold your answer. Why were kings to begin with, and why did they come about? This is something, now you say this is on the book of Judges. Yeah, sure. That's what we're talking about. But what we want to discuss is why kings. Now, if you look in Numbers, the 25th chapter.
Does Hosea 13 and
9 and 10?
yes. I'm just reading it.
I just read it myself.
Verse 11. That doesn't have anything to do with Christ?
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the principle of kings to start with.
Although maybe that he gave the king in anger because of our sin.
No, no, this.
Christ in the wrath.
Well, God didn't take Christ in the wrath. Actually, what happened is that he gave them, the Jews, the seed of David. And because they were so sinful and disobedient, in his anger, he took them to the Babylonian captivity. And they were never, ever again reestablished. So he took them away in his wrath. So that's what he's talking about. But in Numbers 25, and it's all for, the whole chapter, and I don't want to read that, but what I want to do is spend some time on why kings. What was the purpose society had kings to start with? If you want to read this on your own when you go home, do so. It's Numbers 25 and then Judges 3, 1 through 31. You'll see for yourself why and what is being discussed. Why did kings come about to start with? In the book of Revelation, the 6th chapter, there's an interesting thing that most times are not looked at in this light, and because of that we miss a very good cue as to what's being discussed. Revelation 6. And he says, I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, Come and see. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. The question is, who's the he?
Christ.
Adam. Adam. Adam was on a white horse. He was without sin. He was the one that had a bow. He was to defend his people. And he was given a crown as a king. He was the king of the world. And as he went forth conquering and to conquer. All the peoples were under his power and subject to him. If you want to read the second and the third, you'll see that these are the 7 covenants that were discussed before the covenant was brought into existence, which would give us forgiveness of sin. But Adam was seen as a king. Why was Adam a king? Well, this is most notably played out, I think, if you'll agree, in the book of Genesis, the 6th chapter. If you want to look, you'll see in Genesis 6th chapter, we're more familiar with it, with Noah and the ark, but what starts in the discussion of Genesis 6 is something very interesting. It came to pass when the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, which were probably the sons of Seth, saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now what's interesting is they did the choosing, and the basis on which they chose caused them problems. So God said, since you're not going to listen to me to start with, my spirit's not going to always strive with a man. Because he's looking at it from the fleshly standpoint. He has no spiritual inclination as to why he's choosing a mate. His days shall be 120 years. I'm going to give him 120 years to straighten up. And if he doesn't, I'm going to destroy the earth. Now the next verse very quickly says there were giants in the earth in those days. These were not the Remphamites. These were not the Anakims. These were those who were, according to what we can understand from the word giant, these are the ones who rose up in power and might and control. Why? Then we skip quickly to who was the king of Israel. A lot of times people will say David. Well, David was a king. Some say Solomon. Well, Solomon was a king. But who was the beginning king of Israel? Was Abraham a seed? Was Abraham a king? No. Was Jacob a king? No. Well, why did kings begin to be?
Well, they kept crying out, we want a king, we want a king.
Okay, and you notice that's in 1 Samuel 8. We're going to go there. And when they cried, we want a king, God said, give it to them. Why was God not offended?
Oh, I think he was.
Well, let's go to 1 Samuel 8 and we'll see. He said they don't understand what's going on. In verse 9. Now therefore hearken unto their voice. Howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. Manner, a king shall reign. Who was reigning over Israel at that time? David is about 200 or 300 years down the road.
God was ready to know.
Yeah, Christ was directing.
Christ.
Christ was directing the judges.
When did Christ appoint himself as king over Israel? Look at Exodus, the 3rd chapter, and you will see that he explains to Moses in the mount what was going on. He said, I have surely seen, verse 7, the afflictions of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Why was it that Christ had to deliver them? The book of Judges tells the story. The reason that they had to have a king is that nobody individually was established or set up in their social system to protect them. Judges starts off with Judah going over to one of his brethren and whom you wouldn't pay much attention to in battle. Let's look at Judges 1:1. You will see that he went over to Simeon, verse 3, and he says, Simeon, we got to go take care of cleaning out the country. You want to join me and I'll split it with you. Okay, every one of these judges were from different tribes. Every one of them were to those tribes who had gone astray, who were following after false gods, who did not have someone to protect them. So God instituted the judges, the elders, who were to lead and direct these people, and they all were they who were brought back to serve God. Finally, the Jews got tired of that and saw that they couldn't continue as they were, so they went to the last judge, which was Samuel, and said, now make us a king. Samuel says, wait a minute, look in the mirror. Don't you see that I'm a judge? Yeah, but you're not what we need. That's just to one tribe at a time. We want something to coalesce and put us together and give us the power to defend ourselves. We're being picked off one at a time. One would go to the Amalekites. One would go to the Hittites. One would go to the Philistines. One would, and it was all those judges were sent to different segments of Judaism, but together they never fought as a unit, and therefore they couldn't get the job done. God said, listen to him. Appoint him a king. The king that was appointed was Saul. What did Saul immediately start doing? Going through these ites, these peoples who had had the Jews into subjection and defeating them in battle and doing what they couldn't do individually, segmentedly, or separately by themselves. Saul fell because he got real proud of himself. And the next guy that was put in was David. What was David's position in Israel? A killer. What was he signed up to do? Do the job that Saul couldn't complete. What was it that did not allow David to build God a temple? He had blood on his hands. He said, your hands have shed blood. We won't be using that. So David didn't fly off in anger and act like a fool. He put up the money and he told Solomon, he said, here's the plans. when I'm gone build it. Solomon was the king of peace. Interestingly enough, while Solomon was king over Israel, was there any battle fought? No. He reigned in total peace. Now, the premise of all this is that when God came to the Jews, when he met Moses at Mount Sinai, or Midian, he told him, he said, I want to send you to my people. They can't help themselves. They have no leader. I'm going to come down and I'm going to take care of the problem. And you're going to go tell them I'm on my way. And he said, okay, what'll I tell them is your name? He said, Jehovah God. That's my name. And I'm coming to town. And I'm going to give you the power and the strength and the might to lead these people from slavery and bondage. Of course, this has overtones of Jesus Christ all the way through it. You would expect it to be. These are written for our learning, for our example, so that we might know what was going on. So, when Moses started leading the children of Israel, well, that's the first thing they ran into. The Midianites. What did the Midianites cause the Jews to do?
Go around.
Yeah, to go to the prostitutes and the whores. And God, of course, because Baal was the prophet that had been paid the loot, Baal wouldn't curse Israel because he was told by God, you just better not curse my people. And because he didn't do that, he eventually figured out a way to get God to curse them. And the way he got God to not be in favor with them is for whoremongers and prostitutes and stuff that caused the children of Israel to be not allowed to enter the promised land because of their sin. But God had made a promise. I've heard. I've condescended. I've listened. They can't help themselves. What's the story of the judges? These tribes couldn't help themselves. They'd get into certain areas and certain places, and when they would be finally brought to their senses would be after 20 or 30 or 10 or 5 years of slavery. And then they'd cry unto God. The same thing would happen. God would hear their plea. He would send a judge. These judges that he sent, they were the ones who would fight the battle or lead the fight or direct the fight and cause the children of Israel of that tribe to take the situation in hand and have victory. All of them. And the last one that's the most famous, not the last, but one of the last ones the most famous, was Samson. To show that the judges were to cause the children of God to be brought back under the subjection and power of God, Samson was the only one who didn't have a spiritual bone in his body, didn't seem like. And all he wanted was a wild woman. He wouldn't take one from Israel. The problem came about and was because of the fact that everybody did that which was right in their own sight. God says, we won't put up with this. So the children of Israel came to Samuel, and they said, give us a king. God said, listen to him. Now, he would be a precursor of Christ, of course. He would be one that God set up, not Saul, but David, that would have the kingship of the Son of God set on his throne. He would cause the children of Israel to be vindicated and allowed to serve God, because he'd keep under control the enemies by destroying them. What's interesting is that what God said would happen did. And so the children of Israel would be led against their enemies. And when they were led against their enemies under that king, they would be victorious. Again, the similitude of that to Christ is so apparent that you can't even imagine it. But the idea is that God told them. Now in Hosea, the 13th chapter. Let's go back over there again. He said, boys, you didn't figure on what my plan was. You didn't have an idea of what was going on. But I came, and I was your king. Who was the first king of Israel? As a united people, God. What did the king of Israel, Christ, Jehovah God, what did he do to Israel? Pulled him out of slavery. Took him across the Red Sea. Showed by wonderful and powerful not magic, but majestic works, the power of Israel under a single king. What did they do? Well, when Moses couldn't remain faithful, the task was given to Joshua, and before Joshua died, he had gone through and taken the land that God had promised them, but Joshua had a problem. He died. But as long as the elders of Israel under Joshua lived, Israel had peace. But when Joshua died and those elders that were under Israel died, under Joshua died, then all of a sudden the Jews went back to their things that they were doing that were disobedient. They were making things equal to God. Those animal sacrifices weren't worth a dime to them. They were doing all these other things, but it wasn't something that God was pleased with. So the reason, and I used to read this and wonder in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, why didn't God pitch a hissy fit? Well, here, you're in Hosea 13.
Give them enough rope, they'll hang themselves.
Well, not only that, but tell me, which one of these kings could protect you like I did? Which one of these kings can feed you like I did? Which one of these will cause you to be great like I did? Which one of them? And you turned me down. And that's what he's saying here.
Well, that's why I said, yeah, I think God was a little upset that they wanted a king.
They missed the point.
Exactly.
And when they missed the point, God said, okay, you want to be stubborn, you want to be willful. You got the best situation in the world. Listen, if God's for you, what's the rest of the verse? Who can be against you? If he's your king, who's going to bring you under control? Now you think that it was a wondrous thing, and it was, when Moses went in there as God's representative under the king of Israel and led the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. What about when Jesus Christ came to the world, took the Jewish people under the Roman banner and led the Church of Christ to victory, even though the temple was destroyed as a proof that it was no longer for the Jew? And when he led them to victory, he turned it over to the elders and said, here, keep it like it's supposed to. And the preachers of the gospel, these who were supposed to be the judges. And these people were those who failed miserably. And they went back to their own ways, to their own isms, to their own understandings. And they didn't go to God. And the Church of Christ went away into nothingness for a long time. Didn't come back until the gospel began to be preached in the beginning of the 18th century. So the reason and the pattern, the purpose for the book of Judges is to show that God had given these people a chance to govern themselves. And they failed. The reason they failed is they were separated one from another.
Plus they turned their back on God.
Yeah. They didn't have enough strength by one tribe. And see, if you get two tribes, but they'd never say, hey, boys, if it works for two, why don't it work for six? They had their own fight to fight. They had their own battles. But they looked around and saw that these other nations all had kings. That's correct. They said, if it works for them, why can't it work for us? And when they were united in strength, and they had a king to lead them, even though Saul was despicable, as after he reigned as king for a few years, And how many years did Saul reign? 40. And he then was killed because of his disobedience to God. And God had replaced him before he died with David. And he'd made a covenant with David in 1 Chronicles, the 21st chapter, and had told him because of his faithful heart, he would set his son on David's throne. Now there's the reason for the book of Judges. All these people and I have been studying for the past 2 or 3 months, which doesn't mean that I've got it all down, but listen to the logic of God. You see, when Noah was not on the earth, the sons of Seth went in and married anything that they could. They didn't worry about integrity. They didn't worry about morality. They didn't worry about decency. They just found one. They really didn't care. They started marrying 2, then 5, and then 10. And they just were, all they could think about was the flesh. God said, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm not going to preach the gospel to you people. You don't want to hear it and listen. So if you've got to act like fools, as a person that we used to know used to say, if you're going to be dumb, what was the phrase? You better be tough. They were dumb, but they weren't tough. So what happened was God established the kingship. What immediately happened? Saul went on a rampage. Listen, Saul cut the mustard, man. He took the children of Israel the first time that he took them to battle, and they wouldn't trust him almost, and he got enough of them together, and he destroyed who he was going against. They all said, whoa, look what we found here. We may have found something that'll help us. Anytime then anybody would attack one of the tribes of Israel, what was the saying that Israel had that is a part of the instruction of the United States Army, unless you were under Obama? Nobody will be left behind. We're going to fight together. Do you know why that the United States defeated Great Britain, the world power, with all the money, all the boats, all the guns, everything else? They were united. And that was, who was it said, my life you may take, but my integrity never. We're going to fight together. And under George Washington, of course, as their leader. And of course, what did they try to do with George after he won? And
Make him a king.
yeah.
Well, they offered it to him. He turned it down.
Yeah. Sure did. He said, no, we want a democracy. But the idea is that the book of Judges is never looked at as to what purpose God used and established for it to be. Then we don't look at the parallel of the Lord's church. Listen, after the fall of Jerusalem, do you know what the Church of Christ did? It took the world in 150 years. Do you know what happened in 150 years? They came Arian. There came up all these other people that were teaching their false doctrines and their false concepts. You know what happened within another 150 years? Muslimism. Yeah. Muslimism decided to take the world, instead of by peace, to take it by the sword. And we've been fighting them ever since. But the point is that the Prince of Israel today, the King of Israel, Israel being the Church of Christ, fights by love and conversion. And he leads people to peace with God. And as long as we'll follow the God of heaven and his testament and his word, then what is it that strives with us? The Spirit of God. Now, under the days of Noah, when the ark was preparing, God said, I'm going to pull my Spirit out. Yeah, you can't read him in the schools. You can't have him in the colleges. You can't have him in the government. He says, okay, I'm going to pull him out. I'm going to show you boys are fools. I'm still waiting on you. In Hosea 13 again. O Israel, verse 9. Thou hast destroyed thyself, but in me is thine help. I will be thy king. Where is any other that may save thee in all the cities? And thy judges, of whom thou sayest, give me a king and princes. I gave thee a king in mine anger, and I took him away in my wrath. I gave you the kings, and then because they would be disobedient, I took them away in my wrath. But my kingship, my service will be to save you and to keep you out of harm's way and out of the grasp of Satan. And this is the reason that the book of Judges tells the story. And I keep reading. They claim that the book of Judges is the most depressing book of the Old Testament. Well, you leave man in his own sin. You leave him without a helper. You leave him without the king of Israel leading the battle. You leave him on his own, and what's he going to do? Destroy himself. That's right. But when you put him under the power of God, God says, let me ask you a question. Who can do for you what I did? Who can do for you what I can? Who can do for you what I will do? Their answer is, he doesn't have a name. I'm the God. Now, you go back to Psalms 2. So let's go back to Psalms 2. Psalms 2. This is something that's quoted quite a bit, and the statements made are not something that's understood. The reason being, people have not understood the purpose of the king that God was going to establish. Why did the heathen rage? And the people imagine the vain thing. Who is it that carries on and pitches a fit if I'm in control? Who is it that can destroy you when I'm your king? Who is it that will cause you to be led to deceit? Why, he said, the heathen rages, and the people imagine a vain thing, and the kings of earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together. They all join together, but what am I going to do? The Lord said to his anointed, let's break their bands asunder. Cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give you the heathen for thine inheritance. If my son is sitting on the hill, if he's at the top of the mountain, if he's the King of kings and the Lord of lords, he's the head of the church of Christ, he's your king, who can be a king like unto him? That's right. He said, I'll give you the world. I've set my son there, and the heathen can do all they want to. Nobody can separate me from my plan if the church of Christ is following Jesus Christ. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So he says, now be wise. Did you learn by example? Be wise, O ye kings. Be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. And blessed are all they that put their trust in him. Now think, after this was all done, we're over in the book of Hosea. We're about 150 years from Daniel. Turns around and says, you wouldn't listen. I tried to tell you. When you started out, you came on like gangbusters. You've defeated the world's premier power. And you were a ragtag bunch of nothings. But who was your king? Don't flex your muscle and say, I'm Israel. Don't let on like you got blood that nobody else has. It's all red. Don't continue to think that you big, bad, and tough because you're the seed of Abraham. I can tell you why you won. And I can tell you who's leading you to victory. And as long as you followed me, you took the promised land. And after the promised land was taken and you were supposed to go through and clean it out, you'd go up by one or two. Don't think it's a mistake that Judah went to Simeon and said, hey, you want to go with me to battle? Why didn't Judah go to Simeon, to the other 10 tribes, and say, boys, who wants to follow us? Let's go together. Nobody could see the value of having Christ as their king because they now thought that they had it made. They were in their own country, in their own house, and they were going to do it the way they wanted it done. Now, this pattern shows itself exactly in Judges. It's not a mistake that in Samuel, the fact that God allowed them to have a king was his will and his plan. He was going to show them that man would pull them together and they could be a great nation. But they couldn't trust in that man because he was sinful and he would want to go his own way. But when Christ would come, who had been the king that led them out of slavery and out of Egyptian bondage, and they would follow Christ, not only Israel, but the whole world could have the victory that overcomes the world.
Think about the denominationalism that denies he's a king and denies he has a kingdom today.
Exactly.
That's their...
Yeah, they claim he's coming back to set it up in 1,000 years. But isn't that interesting? The premise and the reason for the book of Judges is not, unless you think I'm wrong, you read everything I read, not everything I can get my hands on, but I've spent a serious amount of time because I wanted to see, and I was more interested in the fact that the preachers in the Church of Christ have not written on this subject. They get to Judges and they just skip all over it and go to Samuel because they can cut their teeth on our boy Samuel, because when Samuel comes, there's Saul. And then there's David. And they sing that song, I'm back in the saddle again. But they don't know why that the book of Judges seems to be such a deprecating or such a defeated or such a uninterested or disinterested group of people that couldn't protect themselves. Remember when David would go to battle, what they'd cry? Not win one for the Gipper. That was what came out in the 80s. What did David and the army of God cry? Is there no God in Israel? Now, I was thinking yesterday, David had been prepared. How old was David when he was made king of Israel? 16, 17 years. No, 16, 17 years of age. Made king. When Samuel anointed him king.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. Okay.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. So what had and
Later, right? I mean,
that's all right. How had God prepared David? Well, now David came up to Saul when he wanted to go out and fight Goliath. And Saul said, okay, you a SEAL? No. You a Green Beret? No. You Special Forces? No. Well, son, you got to have my armor because ain't nothing to you. He going to waste you before you even get out to the door. David said, wait a minute. Now listen to this. I fought the lion. I fought the bear. I fought anything else that came with me and up against me. When would he have fought these? Well, you take 16 and you back it up. Figure a 14, 15-year-old kid going up against a lion. Now, do we ever hear much of David fighting a lion?
he wasn't that big either. He wasn't a huge guy that could have overpowered.
No, he's a little bitty kid. And when he fought that lion, what did he use to kill the lion?
Probably a shepherd's staff.
His favorite weapon.
Oh, son, well,
Yeah, he liked that sling. Now, somebody says, well, hey, he wasn't big and bad like Samuel. As they say, used to say in the NFL, a victory is a victory. It doesn't matter if it's by 1 point or 100 points. That lion or that tiger or that bear. Imagine a kid that age going up against a 3 or 4 or 500 pound bear. He said, you think that big sack of ugly that's standing over there on 2 feet cursing the God of Israel, you think I'm worried about him when I fought the rest of these big things? Huh? Yeah, first lick. He said, and another thing, take your armor off. I've got the armor of God, and I'll be able to stand. Well, Saul was defeated mentally. And instead of Saul taking the leadership as a king should have, now we get to England. You ever heard of the Knights of the Round Table? What were they?
They were knights of the Round Table.
well, defenders of the faith.
Keep going. That's true.
They were King Arthur's men.
And why were they King Arthur's men? Okay, the Anglo-Saxons had wreaked havoc. And so what King Arthur did was gather around him the lords or the leaders in certain areas and set up the Knights of the Round Table. For what reason? Let's form a confederacy. Let's start a kingship. Let's start something that can save this country. And they would meet in that, and they would be able to control their own nation. Now, the one that is most prominent, that nobody pays much attention to, who made Pharaoh king of Egypt? Okay. God.
His purpose was for his purpose.
Yeah, but that's not my question. What human being made Pharaoh king of Egypt? Moses was about 140 years later.
Pharaoh said, I'm going to be your king, and that was it.
No, sir. Not at all. Joseph.
He actually made him
You know how Joseph made Pharaoh king of Israel? He bought the stupid place. How did he buy it? Remember, this is the dreaming kid. He had that dream about the 7 fat cows and the 7 that looked like that their skin was tearing off the body because they were starved to death. And so Joseph talked Pharaoh into letting him set up cities in the feast years to store grain. When the 7 years of famine started coming, what did he do? He traded the grain for property. He traded the grain for the cattle that was left. He traded the grain for the family name. He traded the grain for everything that there was in Egypt, because Pharaoh wasn't big, bad, and tough. What Pharaoh did was put the right man at the helm. And Joseph bought Egypt, with some corn and taters. Man's hungry. He'll say, got no food, Joseph. You can read this in the Bible now. Got no food. Trade you 50 acres for a little bit of grain, Joseph would say, take 75. Yes, 75. You give me some. He says, you give me all you got, and I'll give you so much you won't go hungry. Well, he turned around and looked at his wife. She's starving to death. His kids, they're starving to death. What would you do? Hey, something worth more than a piece of property. Cattle, they'd bring in there. And he would buy it. When he got done, in 7 years, Pharaoh owned Egypt. When Joseph got done, yeah. Pharaoh owned Egypt. I've often contended the United States does not need to fight with bullets and machine guns and planes. We have the power of God in this property. That's right. They thought they had us when it came to oil. What did God do? Somebody got the idea of getting this oil out from the rocks. Oh, the Democrats loved that, didn't they? Because what it was going to do is take the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia and all those countries and make it as though it was a dip in the pan. They say now that they have found another source of power, and I forgot what it is, that will give the United States an unlimited amount of energy for 350 years. But still, that's not the power. The power is in the belly. You want people like North Korea to just say, hey, boys, let me tell you, we'll send you some groceries. Tell Rocket Man he's got to forget it. This has been the only thing that the wisdom of our nation either hasn't picked up on, or they've traded for a dollar bill and think that the dollar bill is more phenomenal.
Well, look at the Democrats that traded for that dollar bill.
Yes, sir.
Put in their pocket.
Can't buy friends.
Buddy, let me tell you, if a man's hungry, he'll swap his gold ring, he'll swap his new car, he'll swap anything he's got to feed his belly. And if he loves his wife and family, you got him right where you need him. No, nobody wants to. Did Joseph go in there and say, You boys had me at once. By the way, do you know who Potiphar was? He was Pharaoh's jailer.
Yeah.
Was it coincidental that Potiphar bought Joseph as a servant? That Joseph was in his jail waiting for another 7 or 8 years so he could tell about those dreams? And that he waited another 7 years before that cook remembered that Joseph had told about his dream and got him out of jail and got him to Pharaoh. At that juncture or period of time, Pharaoh wasn't the sole king of Egypt. Look what happened in 14 years. So anyway, the story of the judges. I hope you've enjoyed the study. But the question is, who's going to be king? And they couldn't get over the fact that God had been their king and showed them. Man, can't you remember? Man, look, I turned water into blood. I gave the plague of flies and of this and of that. And all. Look what I did. And I led you out by a strong hand. And if that wasn't enough, when Pharaoh's crack division came out to kill you and take you back home, I drowned every one of them. And what did you do? You walked out on the other side. And then turned your back on me. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I've never had, or never took, I've had it, just didn't take it, the opportunity to teach on the book of Judges. And as a young preacher, I used to read it, and I used to scratch my head, and I used to say, what's this all about? Until one day, I ran up on that verse, and there's a couple of more that I didn't give you tonight. In Hosea, God says, I's your king. Tell me who can be in every city. Tell me who can protect every family. Tell me who can feed every orphan and take care of every widow. Tell me who can be an enemy that's so strong that I can't defeat him. You had the best thing that could have ever been, and you traded me for a human being. Now, isn't that denominationalism today? We're going to stand and sing the hymn of invitation. If I'm not misremembering, it's always true that this is a beautiful song.